As I said in the beginning of the video, it is perfectly valid to be concerned about the growing geopolitical power of China. Personally, I think that this issue has the potential to define global politics for a generation or more in the same way that the power of the Soviet Union did during the Cold War. But if those of us concerned with the rise of China allow a leadership role to be played in this conflict by a loopy cult with little respect for the truth, then we are ultimately just shooting ourselves in the foot. We cannot allow the anti-China position to be defined by liars and crackpots and religious fanatics, which is of course exactly what the Chinese government often dismisses its critics as being. In particular, I am quite worried that the Falun Gong cult is getting in way too deep with the conservative movement of this continent. These days, I have noticed that whenever criticism is made of any Falun Gong aligned media outlet, particularly the Epoch Times, conservatives will rush to defend it. We saw this when Facebook banned the Epoch Times for deceptive advertising practices in 2019, or when mainstream media outlets like NBC or the CBC in this country publish critical reporting on them. There is a tendency to assume that because Falun Gong aligned media is pro-Trump and anti-China, well, they must be the good guys here and their critics just jealous progressives. Just anecdotally, I've also heard stories here in Canada of conservative politicians starting to get into Falun Gong spiritual practice, or otherwise falling under the direct influence of the cult in some way, which is pretty disturbing. Now, the idea of American conservatives coming under the sway of a weird Asian cult might strike you as extremely bizarre, but there's actually a pretty strong precedent for this. Have you ever heard of the Moonies, the mass marriage people? They were started by a guy from North Korea known as the Reverend Moon. Like Master Lee, he also faced persecution in his native land and immigrated to America. And like Falun Gong, his wacky religion was also taken seriously by a lot of conservative Americans because of how stridently anti-communist it was. The Reverend Moon did a very good job marketing himself as a vital ally in the fight against North Korean communism. And as the years went on, he embraced more generally right-wing causes as well. He was a huge supporter of Presidents Nixon and Reagan, and was a particularly outspoken proponent of gun rights. Conservative leaders in other countries loved him too, including Margaret Thatcher and Brian Mulroney. He even founded his own conservative newspaper, known as the Washington Times. Not the Washington Post, where I work, the Washington Times. But in retrospect, backing the Reverend Moon was one of many disastrous alliances the West made in the name of fighting communism. Today we know that the Moonies were a terribly oppressive and traumatizing cult that engaged in brainwashing, forced labor, and the physical and sexual abuse of its members. The Reverend Moon was also eventually outed as a crook who had enriched himself through all sorts of shady financial doings. And as he got older, his views eventually grew so extreme and insane that no one wanted anything to do with him anymore. He died in 2012 as a thoroughly disgraced embarrassment. There is a lot we do not currently know about the inner workings of Falun Gong and Master Lee's empire, but knowing what we know about cults, it is very hard to believe that this story will not ultimately end the same way as the Moonies. One of the most important lessons of the Cold War is that the enemy of my enemy cannot always be my friend. If we want to triumph in a battle of ideas, it is vitally important that those who profess to be on the side of what is morally right and just are able to maintain that integrity. And as long as Falun Gong remains an ally of the West, that task becomes a lot harder than it should be.